I invite you to enter back into the spirit of contemplation and meditation and take these questions into your hearts. Can you remember a time in your life when you felt bullied? I hear some chuckles of recognition. Can you remember a time in your life when you did not stand up for yourself because you believed that maybe there was something wrong with you? Can you remember a time in your life when you experienced hostility or aggression against you, or you were scared by someone and didn't want to admit it for fear of seeming weak? Can you remember a time in your life when you were mean to someone else out of fear? Can you imagine and hold in your heart something that causes you fear today? Can you admit to yourself in this space of sharing just with your own heart that there may be times now when you are afraid of things that are changing in the world and you don't know what to do with that fear? Can you admit to yourself in this space of sharing just with your own heart that there may be times in which the things that we face as challenges in this world seem larger than the resources to address them? Can you ask yourself one final question? Who are the people that you speak to about these fears? And if you cannot think of who they are, who might they be? I want to invite us to come back into this space together and look around. It might be that one of those people is in this room with you today. I want to invite us to also look at our cover today. You might be wondering why there are dogs on the cover of this particular topic. And I'm going to tell you a little story. Some of you will know whose dogs they are. It's my dogs, but I will tell you that right around 2016, some of you remember what that was in our nation. 2017, 2016, my housemate decided to get my dog genetically tested. And I did not know that you could get dogs genetically tested. And I did not know that this had been done. And then I was informed that my dog was now revealed to be truly what she was. And guess what? We had thought she was a pit mix of some sort, but in fact, she was 100% American Bully. It's a new designer breed to have some of the characteristics of the pit bull, but be more friendly and kind. This was not good news to me at that moment in my life. And then I got her a friend who I was pretty sure was a pit bull bulldog mix, but I was never quite sure. So last month I got him genetically tested. And it turns out he's 1/3 American Bully. So there you go, American Bullies on our cover today for our topic. I don't know how many of you were able to think of a time in your life when you had in fact been bullied. I know that I can think of one, I can think of several, but one that I think of a lot is that occurred when I was just 4 years old. He bit off the knobs of my blocks. We had these styrofoam blocks back in the day when we didn't have quite as many toys as it seems like everyone has today. But those blocks were wonderful because we could build forts and walls and all kinds of things. And he bit off the tops of the blocks so they no longer fit together. And he told me he was doing it. And he told me he had done it. And he told me there was nothing I could do about it, which was actually very true because those little knobs were never going back on those blocks. I was 4. It was the 1960s. and freedom was the name of the game for raising kids. The fathers seemed like were always working, and the moms needed time with other adults, so us littles, as we're known now, were left alone. And my friend, who I will call Bradley, figured out without much effort that he could intimidate me, take my toys, break my toys, push me down, and scare me enough to go headfirst down a slide which landed me in the hospital, and on and on. Bradley was actually not particularly angry at me. More likely, he was looking for attention and a way to vent his frustration at other factors in his life. It was, as I said, the 1960s. There were new freedoms for all, including parents. There were drugs. There were not much parental attention sometimes. And it wasn't just me. His little sister was also a target. And mine would have been, except she was just a toddler and mostly hanging out with the moms. So Bradley and I were often left alone, first to play with blocks and make forts. And at an early age, I got very good at making those forks. Just be nice. Ignore him. Look the other way. I remember being told that. And so later in life, when I encountered this again, I just didn't even go to anyone to ask for help about being bullied, because I knew what I would be told. I learned not to mention when something happened, even sometimes something more serious than those styrofoam blocks being damaged. Fast forward, and I think maybe this kind of experience, only vaguely menacing at the time, was more menacing to the psyche because my generation of parents seemed determined to stop all forms of bullying in their tracks. There would be no bullying in the playground, there would be no bullying in the classroom, there would not be any bullying on the play date. That's it, end of story, bullying is out. But for all of you who are shaking your head and believing that bullying has a place in our world, that perhaps it's the way that people learn to go out into the world, you don't have to worry, because a new study from the Washington Post shows that bullying, especially in the younger grades, is back on the rise. It had been almost eliminated. They'd seen the numbers going down, the number of incidents going down for decade after decade, and they had really lowered down to a very minimal level. But now, especially in the younger grades, it's back on the rise. Encouraged by examples at the very top of our nation, from our very top leaders, children are once again preying on the vulnerable and those presumed to be different. What might be really significant is that if you go on the U.S. Department of Education's website, you notice that in 2016, that was the last year that they posted any articles about bullying prevention. There's not been anything else posted since that year. It was pretty regular in the years before that, but they've just stopped. Perhaps that is because bullying has become part of our nation. Now, I know this is a hard topic to think about, but it's one we need to think about because it's something we can do something about. But we can't do anything about it if we don't think about it. In 2016, we began to see, as I said, top national leaders, and Mark mentioned some things about our president, mocking and making fun, deriding and being derogatory against groups of people in our nation, and that changed something among us. And there were numerous recent reports from the Washington Post about this. Here's one thing they say. We could spend all morning doing statistics, and I'm not going to. You'll be glad to know. I'm just going to share a couple. But 20% of the students between the age of 12 and 18 were bullied during the 2016-17 school year, according to the National Center for Education Statistics. And among those students who faced bullying, 15% said they were bullied online or by text, which was a big jump from the last year before that. 2 kindergartners in Utah told a Latino boy that President Trump would send him back to Mexico. And teenagers in Maine sneered banned Muslims at a classmate wearing a hijab. In Tennessee, a group of middle schoolers linked arms imitating the president's proposed border wall, and they refused to let non-white students pass. In Ohio, another group of middle schoolers surrounded a mixed-race 6th grader, and as she confided in her mother, told her, "This is Trump country." Since President Donald Trump's rise to the nation's highest office, his language, considered inflammatory by many, has been condemned also as racist and xenophobic by countless groups. And again, we're not going to go over and over that, but it is seeped into schools and communities and organizations across our nation. Many bullies now target other children differently than they used to, with kids as young as 6 reportedly mimicking the president's insults and reporting them and repeating them word for word to their classmates. And many of us remember before the last election when a teacher in San Jose was dismissed for telling 2 black students, a teacher in San Jose was temporarily dismissed and then reinstated for telling 2 black students that they would be sent back to Africa after Donald Trump was elected. Since then, teachers have also been cited for threatening Muslim students and others openly for also targeting Latinx students, with many of the reported incidents happening here in California, one of the most common places. So I want us to take those into our hearts because it's important for us to recognize that, because we can be a force against this. We can, in fact, be part of the solution. But only if we are aware of the importance that this is happening, and only if we are aware of what this can mean to us over time. In a recently released documentary on the Japanese internment and Executive Order 9066, which I'll play an excerpt from at the Sunday Salon today, a representative from the Anti-Defamation League explains how derision turns into real harm. She says it starts with slurs and then name-calling. It can move to bullying, and then, very quickly, with some individuals, it becomes hate crimes. The next stage is for it to become a societal value, which allows there to be systemic oppression through policies and other things, which we're already starting to see. And then, according to the Anti-Defamation League, the next step is totalitarianism. So it's important for us to pay attention. Is America a bully? Asks a Tufts University researcher who studied every incident of U.S. military intervention from 1776 to 2017. And she concludes, historically, the U.S. advanced from a position of isolationism to reluctant intervener to global police person. And on my research since 2001, I believe the U.S. has transformed itself into what many others in other nations view as a global bully. I do not use that word lightly, but if by definition, she says, a bully is someone who seeks to intimidate or harm those it perceives as vulnerable, then that is an apt descriptor of contemporary U.S. foreign policy. So the question for all of us, the values question for us here on a Sunday morning is, what do we do before these values become even more instilled as societal norms, societal values, the values that our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren will be intimidated by or will intimidate others with? For this is the complex nature of the human endeavor in our times. It's bigger than a question of presidential candidacy or political rhetoric. It is a question about identity, and I believe ultimately a question about fear and anger. Because what it is not is something that will just go away with a change unless we turn our attention to undo the harm that has already been done. So let us take a moment to remember what we know about bullies and bullying, because some of what we've been taught might not actually be helpful. These acts of aggression against people who are perceived to be weak or vulnerable. And let's remember what many of us were taught to do about it. Number 1, just ignore it. How many of you know that this does not work? This does not work, right? Many of us endured months or even years of bullying trying to use this strategy. It does not work. Number 2, don't talk about it because it's embarrassing and it means something is wrong with you. You don't want to be seen as the person who was bullied. But that's also wrong, because the isolation, as we know, is what leads to the statistics that Mark talked to us about, that leads to depression, vulnerability, and even the desire to end one's life. Isolation leads to vulnerability, and vulnerability attracts bullies. Number 3, bullying is not your problem, it's the bullies. This is true, but it's also not that helpful because being bullied has been linked to long-term depression, and it's very important that we know that. It's the kind that the late comedian Robin Williams talked about in his very candid article before his death, the long-standing legacy of it. He was bullied for being overweight as a teenager, and it stayed with him throughout his life, despite lots of success and accomplishment. We have been told to stand up to a bully on your own to prove that you have a backbone. There's a sexist term, but I'm just decided to avoid that one. But research, because people tell people of all genders this now, right? But research has shown that actually it's being connected and supported that's one of the best ways to end bullying. And having clear rules of behavior in organizations is also one of the best ways to say that some behavior is just not going to be tolerated here. And then the last thing, and perhaps this is the most damaging, is that there is really nothing we can do to make a difference on this, and because it's just human nature, and there's especially nothing we can do to make a difference if it's reached a national scale. The thing that we need to remember is just a few years ago, we saw record levels of no bullying. We saw the lowest incidence ever, that there was progress being made. It is important for us to remember this because we know that there are things that we can do. And finally, I want to say that there is something that sometimes we get confused about, and that is that all expressions of anger are bullying, and they aren't. They may make us remember times that we were bullied, but sometimes bullying does happen because people are perceived as vulnerable, and many who have suffered that way sometimes have to be a little loud to feel like they can actually talk back. We all want to work towards right speech, but life sometimes is messy along the way. I think what is important for us to think about today is that we have the ability to address bullying in our midst. We have the ability to tell people that they matter. We have the ability to name an alternative. And in this arena in which we have perhaps an unprecedented amount of fear in our world, bullying can start at any level. On the national stage, it might be economic insecurity, that little fear that maybe we're not the world power we used to be, because statistics are showing that that is true. Perhaps it is what happens when we learn about pandemics or environmental catastrophes. Perhaps it is about our resistance to feeling that we can be safe if we establish standards or guidelines for how we treat one another, not to be controlling or condemning, but rather that's because that's what allows community to flourish in these times. We are here today because we know we aren't powerless. And in this matter, our power lies in acknowledging our own fears, naming them to others, and building connections together, setting boundaries around behavior that does not affirm one another, and practicing a fierce kindness with one another. So I close with some more questions for us. How do we acknowledge our own fear about the economy, about change, about the environmental disasters that seem to be lurking out there, that we see with more frequency? How do we put our energy into not blaming the groups who are already feeling the effects of these trends first, and rather into truly understanding the way that the world is evolving around us? That we may no longer be the economic engine of the world, that we may not promise to new generations the prosperity that some of us have enjoyed. How do we find the courage to talk about what makes us worry, what wakes us up at night? How do we ask those around us to vote so that we can take that step in ending this time of being a bully nation? How do we take the time to be grateful for the chance to ask these questions and recommit to be sure that those who come after us will also have these same opportunities and the same sense of sanctuary? Asking these questions won't give us back that sense of safety we once had because we have seen how easily it could be eroded. They won't immediately take away some ugly truth about our times or our nation, our lives, or the world. They will allow us, though, to begin to claim our voice and reclaim our voice if we have been silenced, and our own ability to act. And when we do this, we reclaim our power and our commitment to say that we all belong, that we all matter, that we all deserve respect and flourishing. And we reaffirm that principled love that is our birthright, that says it matters how we treat one another and that our interdependence knows no bounds. May these walls be strong to keep hate out and keep love in. May we be the ones to make it so.